Good evening, my fellow Trekkies, my fellow gamers, and, well, Kapla, Nuknech, and all that happy Klingon stuff, because tonight, that is what we are here to talk about. We are here to talk about Klingons. More importantly, we're here to talk about reconciling all the different kinds of Klingons so that you can use them in your game or games, or maybe just to clear up whatever it is in your head. It used to be easy. You had Klingons, big swarthy guys in cheap leather suits, vaguely menacing, or overtly menacing, and then all of a sudden they had forehead ridges, and then they started talking in a funny language, and then, well, you know how all this kind of boils down. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, and, well, I'm not quite sure how you could be if you're on this channel, because most of this is all pretty well known to people, but there are some basic kinds of Klingons. You've got swarthy Klingons. You've got bumpy head Klingons from the movies. And then you've got bumpy head Klingons from the TV series, Next Generation onward. And then we get into Discovery. And I will, we'll deal with all this later. But, yeah, to say that there's some contention among the ranks of Star Trek fans about Klingons would be putting it mildly. So, the easiest way to deal with it in game, if you're playing STA, is simply to get this guy. The Klingon Empire Core Rulebook, and I'm still working on the lighting. I'm sorry that the slightly matte, satin finish cover kind of does weird things in the light, but what can you do? But this has basically everything you need to deal with Klingons in your Star Trek Adventures game or your Captain's Log game. I would drop that rule book in here, but it's over somewhere else, and I wasn't thinking very clearly, or I'd have had it handy with me. But if you want to deal with Klingons and you want to be as inclusive as possible, you have to start with this. This is an early Star Trek novel from way back in the day. My copy is signed. And Mike Ford was one of the few real, actual geniuses that I think I've ever met. The man could talk about just about anything. And made it sound as if he knew something about it, because he did. He read everything. He was, like I said, he was a brilliant, brilliant man, and a phenomenal, phenomenal writer. And that novel, The Final Reflection, was made when you had some idea about the movie era Klingons. It refers to them, the bumpy head Klingons that we know of were referred to in that novel as the Imperial Race. while the Klingons that we knew from the television series were called human fusions. They were genetically engineered to look more like humans to deal with the Federation, primarily on a more familiar level. There were also Romulan fusions, which I don't think I have any illustrations of right now. But hold on a second. Let me look at something here, and then I will put this on book cam. Oh, my mistake. My mistake. We do have a picture, more or less. So here are the Klingons we've come to know as the Klingons. This Romulan fusion, and the Klingons we're used to from the TV show, human fusions. This book, by the way, is part of a set. There are 2 books that went with this. This is from the FASA game, the Klingon supplement. This is the 2nd edition of that. And one of the big things that this has going for it, for those who are extremely into Mike's Klingons, is the fact that let's see if I can get that a little better into view. Not really. The autofocus on book cam is not autofocusing real well. I think I confuse the poor thing a whole lot sometimes. Is it really product placement if Dr. Pepper doesn't send me more product? I question. I question that. Back to the subject at hand. What the final reflection and the follow-up novel that Mike wrote, How Much for Just the Planet, and the FASA Klingon supplement. I've got the curtain up. I can hold this up if I just want to show you the covers. What the Klingon supplement and Mike's 2 novels had going for it was they examine what we knew at the time of Klingon culture. And it's a lot different than what would eventually be established on screen with Next Generation and DS9. But it's not entirely impossible to reconcile those 2 different approaches. Some of it could just be seen as terminology. In Mike's work, you had lines in established on-screen canon in Next Gen and DS9. You've got houses. They're essentially the same thing. And you've got the various, approaches to honor. Mike's Klingons are a little more thoughtful and philosophical in places in their approach to battle, whereas the TNG DS9 Klingons had a tendency to be Vikings and motorcycle gangs. you had a little more thought, you had a little more philosophy behind battle. Part of that was just because Mike was a very philosophical dude, and he imparted that on the characters in his novels. All his novels. You should go find anything that says John M. Ford on the cover and read it. It's fantastic. He won a boatload of awards for a reason. But with the final reflection is kind of an origin story about the introduction of things. It predates TOS by many years. The original series characters only appear in it, for the most part, at the very beginning and the very end as part of a framing story. The final reflection itself is a novel within the Star Trek universe, and it's a very controversial one because it looks at the Klingons a lot more even-handedly than people in TOS would be expected to, since the Klingons were the big bads in TOS. The only real appearance you get, and it's been a while since I've read it, the only one I can remember is at some point Kren, the lead character, meets a very young Spock, and they have a brief exchange about being of mixed race within their respective cultures, since Kren himself is a fusion. He is not imperial race, pure blood Klingon, and that is not completely inconsistent with, well, maybe it is. And there's. I hope you read the spoiler warning in the title and in the description. That flashed on the screen when we first started this. Seriously, because I'm going to be spoiling all sorts of things. You had the augment virus in Enterprise creating the smoothhead Klingons, which might seem in utter disagreement with what we saw in TOS. I don't think it is. It also doesn't completely disagree. You can't necessarily import Mike's stuff wholesale into the Star Trek canon, because there have just been so many changes over the past, these many decades. But the notion that you could have genetic hybrids, fusions, does not completely disagree with what we see in Star Trek as the years go by, especially as they start, quote unquote, getting the cure, as one novel put it, decades later in the movie era, when really all you ever see is the bumpy-headed Klingons. And just because we never saw bumpy-headed Klingons in TOS doesn't mean they weren't there. Gene Roddenberry famously quipped, well, they've quipped, Gene once famously quipped that, well, they've always looked like that. We just, didn't see it clearly on the old shows. And that's kind of nonsense, especially when they did Trials and Tribulations. on DS9 when you had both of them together. On K7, Worf looking out the window. We don't talk about this. Well, of course you don't talk about it. There was a genetic disaster, which, in my particular version of the universe, everything that happened in the Enterprise episodes of Affliction and Divergence actually happened, but a lot of what happened in Mike's stuff also happened. They certain members of Klingon leadership saw the advantage to having warriors who looked more like their perceived foes, who could interact with them a little more directly. There's a value to that. So you have, to an extent, you've also got the Klingon human hybrids. You've got, especially, specifically made to look more human. Some of them are born that way, as we saw in DS9, Season 2, with Kang, Kor, and Koloth. They came back with bumpy heads. So, since we saw them in TOS with smooth heads, either they were born that way and quote unquote took the cure. Later on in the movies, we know from a Voyager episode that Sulu interacted with Kang during the events of Star Trek VI, and Kang was bumpy-headed again. So somewhere between 2268 and 2293, he got his ridges back and let his hair grow out. There was a change of government. A lot of things changed. And politics changed. And things of that nature. One of the big things that I keep getting is, well, you can only do it this way, and then you've got the ones who will look at something like Discovery and say how much canon was broken with Discovery, and I don't think it was at all. You never really see a bald Klingon in almost anything, because they typically use the wigs to hide where the makeup was applied for the prosthetics, so they didn't need to. All of a sudden you had a whole bunch of bald Klingons in Discovery, and people were whining and moaning about how they looked so much different than the Klingons in anything else. And I had no problem with the Klingons. Okay, that's not true. I was one of those toxic guys for a while who was not particularly fond of Discovery when it first came out, and it took a while to grow on me. And I'm still not a big fan of the first season, but the Klingons were not the main reason why. I think they had a really hard time trying to figure out what they wanted to do, and as a result, the show was not what it could or should have been. But I liked the Klingons just fine. You got a lot of very typical Klingon activity out of them, even if some of the actors had trouble with the language. But see, I don't have any problem. You've got different ethnicities on Earth. Why can't you have different ethnicities of Klingons? Why can't we've already established that there are a whole bunch of Klingons out there with human genes because of the augment virus from back in the days of Enterprise. Why couldn't you also have right alongside them quote unquote pureblood Klingons with forehead ridges and different, ethnicities of Klingons from different parts of Kronos? They all claim Kronos as the homeworld, but not everybody on Earth looks the same. Do expect all the Klingons to look the same, I think, is asinine. If I'm being honest, I think it's a foolish, narrow-minded way to approach things. You got all sorts of, you got different Klingons. You start growing the hair out on the Discovery Klingons, and they look a whole heck of a lot like the Klingons from the movies. Everywhere from extreme forehead ridges to almost nothing. Because, look at General Chang's ridges. They were not all that pronounced. And I know I've begun to ramble here, so I'm going to cut this off at some point in the not terribly distant future. But my point, when we boil everything out, is don't be afraid to mix and match your sources. If you want to use the Klingon honorifics, Sutai, Epitai, this and Epitai that, which you can find, again, in the FASA Klingon supplement. They've got a whole lot of page space devoted to the intricacies of addressing somebody in the Klingon Empire. But if you want to use that, in addition to, I'm Worf, son of Mog, or, I am Worf, Sutai Mog. That represents his level within the house. Everybody would know that. Within the Klingon Empire. Or at least, factions that remember their history. And there's bound to be some erasure in Klingon history, because when you get right down to it, sometimes they're not all that different from us. And we wipe out huge chunks of history, whether they need to be eliminated or not. But that's a subject of another thing. Down the line, maybe, if I feel like going there. The big thing here is to be flexible. And if you bring in sources that are outside the televised canon, or the movies, let your players know. If you don't have the Klingon supplement for FASA, by all means, hit eBay and find yourself a copy and get it. It's worth it. If you don't have the Klingon Core Rulebook, that's still on sale. Go to Modiphus, and I will provide a link in the description for that. And I've rambled and rambled and rambled. I am going to call it a night, guys. Thank you so much for dropping by. Be sure to give the video a like if you feel like it was of value to you. If you are enjoying what you're seeing on the channel, be sure to subscribe. In the meantime, guys, Qapla'. I'll catch you on the next one.